Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at the impact of war in Britain, in particular the impact of World War One and World War Two on industry. So let's start by looking at the changes in industry during World War One. So when industry was reorganised during World War One, Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister at the time, introduced something called war socialism in 1917, so a couple of years into the war there. This meant that the government took control of resources of the country. The railway network was taken over so that transport could be coordinated more effectively, so it was run by the government rather than by private companies. In 1914, there had been 120 different railway companies, and Lloyd George created a single unified system so it would be much more easy to coordinate and organise movement around the country, which is very important during wartime. All coal mines were also taken over as well, and production reached an all-time high of 262 million tonnes per year. Miners all received a national minimum wage for the first time. So it was all very positive in terms of more coals being produced, a more unified rail network, miners receiving a minimum wage. Shipyards were taken over to ensure that ships or vessels were built to replace the many being sunk by German U-boats, those submarines. Lloyd George encouraged the employment of women in heavy industry, especially in munitions work, which was creating weapons and things to use like bombs in World War One. The Ministry of Labour was set up as well to organise the nation's labour force, and it introduced directed labour, which gave the government the power to force skilled workers to remain in occupations of national importance. So this links to DORA, where the government was able to force people to stay in occupations of national importance, as in rather than them leaving that job to go somewhere else to a different job, or leaving that job to go to the army. What they really want is people in skilled occupations in munitions factories and railways and mining to stay in those jobs because they were absolutely essential to winning World War One. Trade unions also became far more important as well, looking out for the rights of the workers. So in general, industry in World War One was more centralised, more unified under the government. The government took control of it, and in many ways it was quite a positive change. We've briefly mentioned the mobilisation of women, and one of the key changes to industry in World War One was indeed the mobilisation of women. Now that happened both in the armed forces, where there were some women recruited into the Navy and the Army, although they were not in combat roles, they would have been in different roles, but also in other areas in the workforce. So between 1917 and 18, women were mobilised. And this happened because the British industry began to suffer desperate shortage of labour because huge numbers of men were fighting on the front lines in the war. So there were lots of jobs that opened up. So by early 1916, Britain had up to 2 million workers fewer than was necessary to keep the country going. Gradually, more and more women were employed to do these previously known as male jobs. So for example, if we have a look at this little grid here, we can see that in 1914, so the beginning of the war, in metalwork there were 170,000 women, and by 1918 there were 594,000 women working in metalwork. So that's a huge increase. And of those women working in metalwork, some was just an increase in general, new jobs opening up because they needed more metalwork to create munitions and things during the war. But also 195,000 of those women were needed to replace men who had left those metalwork jobs to go and fight on the front lines. Chemical work similarly was important for munitions. 40,000 women in 1914, 104,000 by 1918. Some of that's a general increase because they needed more chemical work than they had done previously, and also 35,000 women replaced men who had been in those jobs. In the government also women were needed as well. Previously only 2,000 women had worked in government. Again, huge numbers of men being required on the front lines and in army roles, combat roles. So 225,000 women by 1918. That's one of the largest groups to increase for women's work during the war. 197,000 women needed to replace the men in government roles before the war. Transport, 18,000 previously, 117,000 by 1918, 42,000 replacing men during the war. So metalwork and government roles were particularly important for women to replace the jobs of men. There were also 260,000 women working in what was known as the Land Army, taking the place of men on farms, as well as voluntary joining the armed forces. So we had women in the auxiliary army who took up the office jobs, freeing men to fight, women in the Royal Navy doing the same thing, so taking over office duties so men could take up combat roles, women in the Royal Air Force, so obviously not flying planes or anything at that point because it wasn't seen as a female role until a little bit later. Instead they create, again, office and domestic duties that they're taking over. So in industry, we do see in factories in particular and in munitions, they're sometimes called munitionettes, large numbers of women keeping those factories going. Some men accepted it, seeing it as a necessity because there were huge numbers of men going off to fight during the war, and it was necessary to have women in those industries to ensure that the war effort was successful. But you would also see some men perhaps a little bit frustrated at the fact that women were taking on what was seen as traditionally a male job, and they might have been worried that perhaps women who could be paid less by law at the time might replace them longer term. So look out for the differences in the sources. In terms of changes in industry in World War II, a man called Ernst Bevin was Minister for Labour, so in charge of the workforce during World War II, Ernst Bevin. Ernest Bevin worked closely with employers and trade unions to make Britain's wartime production as efficient as possible in World War II. So workers' freedoms were really severely restricted in World War II. Wages and hours were strictly controlled and workers could be moved around. And that links to the Emergency Powers Act in World War II. The government had the right in the Emergency Powers Act to ask citizens to do, of the country, to do anything that they wanted them to, and they could ask them to pretty much move anywhere as well. So Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labour, is requiring workers to work whatever hours and whatever wages was necessary. From 1942, men could opt for mines rather than the armed forces. So if they were conscripted, then men sometimes might opt to go and work in the mines instead of going to the front lines, or they might not opt to, but they might be forced to go and work in the mines. And so it might be an unpopular move if someone had been feeling that they were going to go and fight for against Hitler, and then they get there and they realise they're actually going to go and work in a mine. Other people might be really overjoyed about the fact that they're working in the mines, staying at home. Families might be more pleased by that than going to fight on the front lines. The people who were conscripted to work in the mines rather than the armed forces were known as the Bevin Boys. Bevin Boys because Ernest Bevin was the Minister of Labour at the time, asking them to go and do those jobs. Women for the first time were also conscripted into the labour force in World War II. So 8 times as many women took on war work in the Second World War as had done in the First World War. 8 times as many. That's a huge number, a huge increase in women. And that's because it's gone from being voluntary to conscripted jobs. So we've started to mention the mobilisation of women in industry. Let's take a little bit more of a look at it in World War II. So in World War II, women were mobilised in a different way. From late 1941, women, unless they were pregnant or had small children, were sent to work in industry or the auxiliary armed services. So by 1943, 90% of all single women and 80% of married women were in work of national importance. And that could be in things like the land army, farm work. It could be in the Air Force, Navy or Army, like we've previously mentioned, doing office work, freeing men to go and do their combat roles. Or it could be in other roles in services and in munitions factories. The most popular thing for women to join was the army because women thought the uniforms were more exciting than the dull khaki uniforms of the land army. So there were preferences, just like the men had preferences in what they could be conscripted to do. By 1944, 450,000 women were in the armed services and only 80,000 women were working for the land army. So that's not massively balanced. This was less than the 260,000 women who worked for the land army during World War I. So actually, in terms of mobilisation for women into roles where they're going to create more food, they weren't massively successful. Success of getting people involved would have depended on how exciting the jobs looked. Despite not being involved in combat, women did hard work and often very dangerous jobs too. So working in mechanics, as welders, creating the planes. Some women were pilots, carpenters and munitionettes in the factories. Munitionettes did very dangerous jobs in the factories. The chemicals they were working with could lead to them turning yellow, their skin turning yellow, their hair turning yellow, sometimes falling out. They could get poisoning from that. Sometimes when they're working with explosives and chemicals, there were accidents and people lost limbs, or in some cases might have died in those accidents in the factories as well. Many women also entered voluntary services in World War II. 1 million women joined the Women's Voluntary Service by 1943. 180,000 worked in civil defence in the government. 47,000 worked in fire services. 130,000 served as messengers and dispatch riders for the post office. And some women ran nurseries to allow other women to go and work in factories. Some drove ambulances. Some worked in medical centres as well. So there are lots of ways that women were involved both in factories, in industry, and in other jobs and roles as well. So what was the legacy or the long-term impact of World War II on industry? Well, the economic legacy of Second World War includes a number of different things. Nationalisation of key industries like the railways being under government control. Debt was a huge thing, and loans from the USA as well. So Marshall Aid was something that happened in 1948. The government in Britain had used huge amounts of money to pay for World War II, and they were left almost bankrupt. As a result, in order to get the country going again and to help people who were returning from war, the government needed money. So they turned to the USA, who promised them something called Marshall Aid to get industry going again. The government used the loans from the USA Marshall Aid to nationalise road haulage, railways and coal industries in 1947 and steel in 1951. So they're relying on the government are relying on USA loans in order to promote growth and get them creating lots of new products again. By adopting these ideas, economist J.M. Keynes' book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, in 1936, the government learned how to keep the economy vibrant by increasing public spending. This meant that there's never been a depression like the one in the 1930s again. So after World War II, unlike the 1929 Great Depression and things that were seen in between World War I and World War II, after World War II there wasn't the same depression, even though lots of money had been spent and Britain was in debt. There were economic challenges. The Treasury, which is the group of people in charge of all the money in the country, headed by a man called Hugh Delton as Chancellor of the Exchequer, faced urgent problems. Half of the wartime economy had been devoted to mobilising soldiers, warplanes, bombs and munitions. And they're transitioning now to a peacetime budget. So these things aren't needed. They don't need as many soldiers. They don't need as many warplanes, bombs or munitions. So all of these jobs are going to go. So they needed to rethink how they would employ everyone so they don't end up with lots of people unemployed and a lack of production. Financial aid through the Lend-Lease from the United States was abruptly and unexpectedly terminated, so it stopped in September 1945. And new loans from the US and Canada were absolutely essential to keep living conditions tolerable. So in the long run, Labour was committed to nationalising industry and national planning of the economy, to more taxation of the rich, less of the poor, and to creating the hope of a better future through a welfare state, especially a free medical service for everyone, which if you look at the revision video on social divisions and how those changed in World War I and World War II, you can see in a little more detail. So in terms of the legacy of World War II on industry, World War II had a huge impact in sort of nationalising industry, the government taking a much greater role and responsibility in growing the economy and in looking out for the workers. And they encouraged a lot more women into jobs and factories. But long term, one of the problems they had was all of the growth in industry was geared towards war and also based on lots of loans and when the US withdrew the loans in 1945, they had to turn to further loans from the US and Canada in order to keep the economy growing and prevent there being a depression or inflation and worse living conditions or economic conditions for Britain. So that's the end of this short video looking at the impact of World War I and World War II on industry. Perhaps have a go at an exam style question before your exam. Good luck with your revision.